On a calm night, an oil tanker's anchor gets wedged in the side of the Blackthorn, sinking the Coast Guard ship. In the span of 3 minutes, 23 men are killed. It's 1804 on the 28th of January 1980, and the US Coast Guard Blackthorn departs the Gulf Tampa dry dock in Tampa Bay. The Blackthorn unmoors under the command of Lieutenant Commander George Seppel. Earlier in the day, the crew took the ship out for a 2-hour sea trial. They had problems with the main generator. The generator was fixed, and now Seppel wants to see how the ship fares. The sun is setting as the ship leaves and a winter night sets in. Although it's dark, it's a calm and pleasant night with clear skies and good visibility. The ship is en route to Galveston, Texas, having been laid up in the yard for 3 months for repairs and to add new equipment. 6 officers and 44 crew are on board the ship. First launched in 1943, the Blackthorn is a United States Coast Guard cutter built by the Marine Iron and Shipbuilding Company in Duluth, Minnesota. The ship is 55 meters long, has a beam of 11 meters and a draft of 4 meters. It's fitted with modern radar and communications equipment. Ships like the Blackthorn are also referred to as buoy tenders, and the Blackthorn was originally built to service navigation buoys, day beacons, and radio beacons. Like most buoy tenders, the Blackthorn has been used for a whole range of other purposes. In its 40 years of service, the ship served as an icebreaker in the Great Lakes and performed rescue operations like searching for the survivors of the plane crash National Airlines Flight 470, which crashed in the Gulf of Mexico after encountering severe turbulence. It also assisted ships in distress and was involved in searching for survivors from the Esso Greensboro, which collided with the Esso Suez in heavy fog up the Mississippi River. As the ship heads out into Sparkman Channel in northern Tampa Bay, the crew are probably excited to be back out at sea. There's a new captain in command, George Seppel. This is his first time in command of a ship at sea for almost 5 years. Seppel has been on shoreside assignments with the Coast Guard, and he's finally back out on the water. Seppel has had a long break, but he's an experienced sailor. Before his shore assignments, his previous seagoing experience included 16 months as chief officer of a Coast Guard patrol boat, 25 months as a ship's executive officer, and 16 months aboard 2 other Coast Guard ships. Despite not being at sea for 5 years, Seppel is only required to take a rules of the road refresher course before taking command of the ship. 7 of the Blackthorn's crew members are also new to the Coast Guard, and this is their very first assignment at sea. The more experienced crew members have also been ashore during the refurbishment of the Blackthorn. For this first journey in 3 months, the Blackthorn's crew will work on a modified rotation. Extra personnel are manning the bridge watch and engine room. In case of an emergency, 4 men are on the forecastle, ready to let the anchors go, and the after steering is also manned. The after steering is a secondary steering mechanism below deck. 3 officers on the navigation team on the bridge are plotting the ship's position, manning the radar, and taking visual bearings. On the way down Sparkman Channel, Seppel sees a Russian passenger ship, the Kazakhstan, to the right in Seddon Channel. According to the Coast Guard report into this incident, the Kazakhstan is also just getting underway, and it's heading south on a converging course with the Blackthorn. The Blackthorn is making 12 knots and it's pulling ahead of the Kazakhstan. The Blackthorn turns into Cut D Channel ahead of the Russian ship. After the Blackthorn clears Pendola Point and after he's satisfied the ship's responding normally, Lieutenant Commander Seppel orders the executive officer, Lieutenant David Crawford, to take control of the ship. Lieutenant Crawford takes command and Seppel goes below deck to the engine room to check the condition of the ship's engine with the engineer officer. As the ship sails, the navigation team plot fixes periodically and inform the officer in command. No one is actually assigned to continually plot the ship's position. This only happens on the Blackthorn during navigation in fog. The commanding officer is navigating primarily by seaman's eye. The navigation team recommend times to turn to a new course, but no dead reckonings or turn bearings are being laid on the chart. These are familiar waters for the officers and crew. Tampa Bay is organized into shipping channels called cuts, and the commanding officer is navigating from one cut to another by sight. Inside the cuts, the channels are as deep as 13 meters, and outside the cut, the depth drops to as shallow as 4 meters, which is roughly the same draft as the Blackthorn. Lieutenant Crawford also uses landmarks to confirm the ship's position in the channel as it sails. While the Blackthorn starts its outward journey, just outside Tampa Bay, the SS Capricorn has been preparing to weigh anchor and head into the bay. The Capricorn is an oil tanker almost exactly the same age as the Blackthorn. In 1961, the Capricorn was enlarged with the addition of a new mid-body section. It's a large tanker at 184 meters long, 23 meters wide, and a draft of 10 meters. The bridge is at the rear of the ship, and it has a raised forecastle deck. It has 2 open wings that extend outward the entire width of the hull, and the ship's bridge crew have access to modern navigational aids. The Capricorn has been anchored in the fairway anchorage outside of Egmont Key since 10:27 in the morning, after traveling 4 days from St. Croix on the Virgin Islands. The ship needs a pilot to guide it into the bay, and they've been at anchor waiting their turn for a pilot. It's bound for Florida Power and Light Co. at Weeden Island Station in Upper Tampa Bay with a volume of cargo equivalent to over 151,000 barrels of oil. At 1846, the SS Capricorn weighs anchor and proceeds at 12 knots into Egmont Channel. Captain George McShay is the master of the ship, and on board he has 9 licensed officers, 23 unlicensed merchant seamen, and 1 extra person who's not part of the crew. After the ship weighs anchor, the port anchor is left ready to let go at the front of the ship, on the port side, in case it needs to stall its speed quickly. The 6-ton anchor is hanging on the side of the ship and set on its brake. The starboard side anchor is locked in position. At 1911, Tampa Bay ship's pilot Harry Knight embarks and takes control of the ship's navigation. As a pilot, Knight will use his knowledge of Tampa Bay's waters to steer the large oil tanker safely to its destination. Knight's an experienced Tampa Bay pilot who's brought over 1,000 ships into the bay. As well as having navigated many ships into Tampa Bay, this is also Knight's 3rd time on the Capricorn, so he's familiar with the ship's maneuvering characteristics. At the suggestion of Captain McShay, he increases the ship's speed slightly up to almost 14 knots. Most likely he feels he's in control of the situation. As he brings the Capricorn into the Egmont Channel, Knight makes an open securite call on Channel 13 using his handheld radio to announce the presence of the Capricorn to all ships in the area. Back on the Blackthorn, during its journey south through the Hillsborough Bay area of Tampa Bay, it meets and passes a tug, the Pat B, which is pushing a loaded barge northwards into Cut E Channel. The 2 vessels contact each other on Channel 13 and arrange to pass port to port. This happens as planned, but the Blackthorn doesn't move over as the ships approach each other. Instead, it maintains a position close to the center of the channel, forcing the Pat B to move over to the right. They pass with less than 12 meters between them, which is not unusual for the narrow cuts in Tampa. Next, the Russian passenger ship, the Kazakhstan, catches up with the Blackthorn. It's increased its speed since it departed. As it catches up, the pilot on the Kazakhstan, Gary Maddox, tries to contact the Blackthorn to arrange a passing. He calls on the radio, but there's no response, and he has to reduce the Kazakhstan's speed to avoid getting too close. Eventually, Maddox manages to raise the Blackthorn on Channel 13 and asks the ship to give way. His request is granted, and the brightly lit Kazakhstan passes in Cuts D and C. The Blackthorn re-enters the channel in Cut C after the Kazakhstan passes, and Lieutenant Crawford asks Lieutenant Commander Seppel, who's back on the bridge, if he can relieve him of command of the ship. Seppel, the commanding officer, instead of taking command of the ship himself, directs Ensign John Ryan, the officer of the deck, to take command instead. Ensign Ryan is one of the Coast Guard's new recruits. He became certified as an underway officer of the deck the previous year in September 1979. This is his first assignment at sea. Shortly after 1955, the Blackthorn makes the turn into Cut A channel with Ensign Ryan in command. At 2000, the Capricorn passes Egmont Key with the Egmont Key lighthouse abeam to starboard and then proceeds towards Mullet Key channel. Pilot Knight sees the Kazakhstan coming outbound ahead of them. It's 7 or 8 miles away east of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in the vicinity of Cut B channel. At the same time, he also receives a radio call from a tug called Ocean Star, which is pushing a loaded barge towards the Capricorn in Mullet Key channel. The Capricorn enters Mullet Key channel and Knight centers the ship's position in the channel. On the bridge of the Capricorn, along with Pilot Knight and Captain McShay, are the third mate and the helmsman, who are starting their 2000 to 2400 hour watch. Captain McShay and the third mate check the radar periodically. Again, similar to the Blackthorn, no one on the Capricorn is plotting the Capricorn's position on the navigation chart. Navigation is happening primarily by seaman's eye. The pilot knows the water and the landmarks. At 2000, ordinary seaman O'Boyle replaces the lookout on the ship's bow. He works alone, equipped with binoculars. His instructions are to only report poorly lit or unusual vessels. The idea is to keep the bridge free from being inundated with routine calls. On relieving the previous bow lookout, he's informed that the port anchor is ready for letting go. The Capricorn meets the tug, the Ocean Star, in Mullet Key channel. They pass each other and soon afterwards, Knight takes sight of the Kazakhstan coming outbound. The Kazakhstan has passed underneath the Sunshine Skyway Bridge and is traveling in excess of 14 knots. Knight sees the Kazakhstan turning into Mullet Key channel from Cut A. As the ships approach, radio communications are established between the two pilots. They agree to pass port to port. The two pilots switch to radio channel 77 to continue their discussion as they approach each other. The two vessels pass at around 15 meters, and Maddox on the Kazakhstan apologizes to Knight for crowding him. After they pass, Knight, still talking to Maddox on channel 77, leaves the port bridge wing and goes to the starboard bridge wing to look for the Mullet Key range light. A range light is a set of two lights arranged at a distance from each other. When sailing in a channel, the pilot, Knight, wants the two lights to line up with each other, which confirms the ship is in the center of the channel. If the lights don't line up, then the ship is not in line with the channel. Captain McShay follows Knight as far as the pilot house and stops at the radar. Now Knight sees the white masthead range lights and green side lights of the Blackthorn as it's coming outbound on the same route as the Kazakhstan. It's east of Sunshine Skyway Bridge near the beginning of Cut A channel. Captain McShay on the Capricorn has been checking the radar periodically and now he sees the Blackthorn. The bow lookout, O'Boyle, also sights the Blackthorn, which is well lit and there isn't anything unusual about it, so he doesn't report it. The pilot, Knight, switches his handheld radio back to channel 13 and tries to contact the outbound Blackthorn. He gets no reply. It seems the Blackthorn is difficult to reach over the radio. The Capricorn is the second ship to struggle to reach the Blackthorn. Knight walks back into the pilot house, stands just to the left of the center line of the ship, and observes the relative bearing of the oncoming vessel. He tries to call again, but again he gets no reply. Knight has to keep the Capricorn in the channel because of its deep draft. He's also approaching his turning point between cuts. He decides not to change the Capricorn's course or speed. Radio is not the only way a ship can communicate with another vessel. The captain, or in this case the pilot of the Capricorn, can sound the horn. One short blast will signal that they're proposing a port-to-port passage, which is the convention for passing in a channel. But Knight doesn't sound the horn. According to the Coast Guard report, he later explains that he doesn't want to limit the options of the other vessel. At this point, it isn't completely clear what direction the Blackthorn will take after it passes under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. After it passes under the bridge, when it's between the Capricorn and the bridge, the Blackthorn may turn left into the Intracoastal Waterway, which is a southbound waterway with roughly 6 meters of depth. That's plenty of water for the smaller Blackthorn. If the ship goes that way, it'll cross the channel in front of the Capricorn. If it doesn't, it'll turn right from Cut A into Mullet Key Channel and pass the Capricorn in a conventional port-to-port passing. Around this time, the Blackthorn appears to have passed Light Buoy 1A. According to the Coast Guard report, Pilot Knight makes a judgment that the Blackthorn will cross in front of the Capricorn and go into the intracoastal waterway. One account says that when Knight was previously observing the bearing of the oncoming vessel, it was just off the starboard bow. This would suggest it's heading towards the intracoastal waterway, which means the ships will pass starboard to starboard around the time the Blackthorn heads out of the channel. Captain McShay has also been watching the situation develop. He's concerned about the lack of radio contact, and he's also trying to evaluate the situation. He leaves the radar, walks up alongside Knight and says, "What's this guy trying to prove?" Pilot Knight doesn't respond to the comment or let on that he thinks it's possible the approaching ship will leave to go into the intracoastal waterway. The bow of the Capricorn is coming up alongside Light Buoy 2A. The Capricorn has to begin its turn into Cut A channel soon, or they risk grounding on the southeast bank. Pilot Knight feels there's now no chance for a port-to-port passing, so he puts the rudder left 10 degrees and sounds the 2 short whistle blasts. This is the standard maritime signal to indicate that he intends to pass the Blackthorn starboard to starboard. Captain McShay seems to have reached the same conclusion as Knight, although it's not entirely clear what his judgment is about the Blackthorn's movements, and he doesn't object to the pilot's actions. O'Boyle, on the Capricorn's bow, decides to report the Blackthorn to the bridge, but then he hears the 2 whistle blasts from the air whistle just behind him. He knows the men on the bridge have seen the oncoming vessel, so he doesn't make the call. The Blackthorn doesn't reply using its horn or via radio. As the Blackthorn approaches the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, Lieutenant Crawford returns to the bridge from below. He's on the port bridge wing along with Lieutenant Commander Seppel and Ensign Ryan. Ryan brings the Blackthorn under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge just to the right of the green navigation light positioned on the underside of the bridge to mark the center line of Cut A channel. Lieutenant Commander Seppel then goes inside the pilot house, looks at the radar and sees a large radar contact to the east of Mullet Key Channel Buoy 15. He looks ahead and sees the bright lights of the Kazakhstan on the same relative bearing as the radar contact. It seemed from the Coast Guard report that he thinks the radar contact is the Kazakhstan. Presumably thinking there's nothing to worry about, he stops looking at the radar and moves to the chart table to look at the chart and to refresh his memory on the track line past Egmont Key. Soon after the Blackthorn clears the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, Lieutenant Crawford spots the Capricorn. He asks Ensign Ryan if he's spoken over the radio with a vessel in the same area as the Kazakhstan, just ahead in Mullet Key Channel. Ryan replies he hasn't, and he asks Lieutenant Crawford to contact the inbound vessel on Channel 13 so he can concentrate on tracking its movements. Lieutenant Crawford calls the inbound vessel over the radio, and according to the Coast Guard report, he hears a garbled response followed clearly by the words, "Coming out of anchorage, won't be in your way." Lieutenant Crawford will later testify that Lieutenant Commander Seppel, who's at the chart table, orders him to reply "Roger" to acknowledge the transmission. Lieutenant Commander Seppel denies giving that order, and no other witnesses recall this exchange. But Lieutenant Commander Seppel definitely overhears Crawford's outgoing call on the radio, and this is how he's alerted to the presence of another vessel in addition to the Kazakhstan. It appears from the Coast Guard report that Crawford has mistaken a conversation taking place between the Ocean Star and the Kazakhstan for a response to his call to the Capricorn. The Ocean Star is actually informing pilot Maddox on the Kazakhstan that it will cross the channel to enter the anchorage east of Egmont Key, and that it'll be out of his way and leave him plenty of sea room. Ensign Ryan on Blackthorn takes a bearing on the oncoming vessel. He checks the radar. Then he takes a second bearing on the incoming vessel. He determines that it's passing from right to left ahead of them. He then turns around and takes a bearing on the Cut A range light behind them. It's the same bearing as the previous one he took. This confirms that the Blackthorn is moving in a straight line and the Capricorn is moving from right to left in front of them. Ensign Ryan hasn't heard anything from Lieutenant Crawford and he assumes that he's successfully arranged to pass port to port. Ryan decides to start the Blackthorn's right turn into Mullet Key Channel. He turns early to provide more sea room for the oncoming vessel. He orders the helmsman to turn right to 263 degrees, which is the compass course for Mullet Key Channel. Ryan doesn't sound the maritime standard one short whistle blast to indicate he intends to pass port to port. It seems from the Coast Guard report that there's a general unwritten policy on the Blackthorn to not sound a whistle signal if a passing has been agreed on the radio. The logic is that whistle blasts could confuse other vessels in the area. The Blackthorn turns just 5 to 10 seconds after the Capricorn starts its turn. Then Pilot Knight on the Capricorn orders the rudder 20 degrees left. The Capricorn's already started its turn, and so this 20-degree turn is probably to open up the distance between the two ships. We don't know if Knight realizes the ships are on a collision course, but Captain McShay on the Capricorn sees the range lights of the oncoming ship line up quickly. Ships of a certain length have two white lights, one lower at the front of the vessel and one higher towards the back. If the lights line up so you can see one above the other, it means the ship is sailing directly towards you because they make a straight line. Now, Knight orders the ship hard left, probably in an attempt to avoid a collision. Then he sounds the danger signal when he realizes the two ships will collide. The Capricorn's chief engineer opens the deckhouse forward starboard door to go out and get some air. As he steps out, he hears the Capricorn's danger signal and sees the Blackthorn about to collide with his ship on the port bow. He runs down to the engine room and tells the first assistant engineer to immediately answer all bells. This means the engine room must be ready to take orders and immediately act on them. As the Blackthorn starts its turn, Lieutenant Commander Seppel steps onto the port bridge wing and sees the oncoming Capricorn for the first time and shouts, "Where the fuck did he come from?" He hears the whistle signals from the oncoming vessel and yells to Ryan, "Right full rudder." Both vessels are turning into each other. No one can stop the collision. Seppel shouts out, "Stand by for collision." Then he goes to the controls and puts the engines full astern to slow the ship as much as possible before they collide. The Capricorn and the Blackthorn collide at 2021, port bow to port bow, almost directly head-on between 5 and 15 seconds after the Capricorn sounds its danger signal. All but one of the Blackthorn's anchor detail personnel scramble off the bow onto the buoy deck. Seaman Michael Rhodes, who's working the radio headset, can't unhook the headset in time and ends up trapped on the bow. There's a huge impact and the Blackthorn is immediately pushed into a starboard list of around 15 degrees. It then rolls to port and settles on a port list of around 5 degrees. The Capricorn stops its engine straight away. Both vessels continue sliding against each other, and as they do, the Capricorn's port anchor that's ready to drop scrapes along the side of the Blackthorn. It pierces the Blackthorn's hull and rips a huge gash along the side of the ship. The brakes on the anchor chain fail as the weight of the Blackthorn pulls at it. Eventually, the anchor becomes embedded in the shower locker of the Blackthorn. Next, the Capricorn has to take evasive action to avoid colliding with the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. Either Knight or McShay puts the engines full astern, keeps the rudder hard left, and aims to run aground in the north side of Cut A. The ship continues turning left, decelerating as it goes, but now it's towing the Blackthorn stern first with its anchor. It's pulling the Blackthorn, but the anchor chain continues to run out. O'Boyle, on the Capricorn's bow, watches as the chain runs out until a cloud of rusty dust from the chain blurs his vision. The situation must be a complete shock to the whole crew of the Blackthorn, especially the new recruits. Not only has the ship crashed into a much larger tanker, but it's also listing and is being pulled backwards out of control. About 20 off-duty crew members assemble on the ship's mess deck, the normal mustering location of the damage control party. They wait for instructions. No one is expecting this just 2 hours after departing the dock. The 3 men in the after steering compartment rush out on deck, dogging the hatch behind them. The crew on the mess deck are panicked and confused. Some of the new recruit members who are on their first Coast Guard assignment freeze up in shock. They're probably unfamiliar with events at sea, let alone a dangerous situation like this. Some go to the notice board on the starboard passageway next to the mess deck to check their collision at sea assignments. It seems most of the crew don't even know where to go. Boatswain's mate Bartel tries to take charge. He orders the crew on the mess deck to set condition zebra, which means they have to close all watertight doors, hatches, and portholes. He also orders damage control equipment to be taken out of the locker and for personnel to report to their stations. The Capricorn's anchor chain is attached to the anchor lodged in the Blackthorn. As the chain spools out from the Capricorn, the ships separate and start to drift apart. The anchor chain continues to spool out and the distance between the ships widens. 2 officers find crew member Bruce Lafon naked and injured in the port main deck passageway. He's in shock and he's trying to tell them something about an anchor in the shower. He's been hit by the anchor as it came through the hull of the ship. One officer goes to the shower area to look at the damage and he finds the Capricorn's anchor wedged in the side of the ship. On the bridge, the quartermaster makes a mayday call over the radio on channel 16. He gets through to Group St. Petersburg Coast Guard at 20:22, 1 minute after the collision. They ask what the state of damage is, and the quartermaster responds with, "Stand by." No one's quite sure what's going on, and no further transmissions are received from the Blackthorn. Quartermaster Gary Crumley goes to the chart room to get the inflatable life jackets for the bridge crew. He never returns. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Seppel asks the officer at the navigation desk where the nearest shoal or shallow water is. He's probably planning to run the ship aground before it can sink. The nearest shoal is Mullet Key Shoal to the north. Seppel brings the engines from full astern to a stop. It's not clear what happens next on the bridge. The situation must be a huge shock for the crew, but if they can close all the watertight doors and get the ship to somewhere shallow, they can possibly save the ship. The 2 ships have now drifted apart and the Capricorn has slowed down. The chain, attached to the anchor which is still stuck in the side of the Blackthorn, slackens. As the 2 ships drift apart, the distance between them brings the fully laid out anchor chain back into tension. The Blackthorn rolls suddenly over to port. The whole ship is pulled through the water. Lieutenant Commander Seppel shouts, "Abandon ship." No one has time to sound the order over the ship's public address system as the vessel rolls onto its left side. The ship's service generators trip off. All the lights go out throughout the ship and the ship is plunged into darkness. The crew on the mess deck scatter in all directions. Boatswain's mate Bartel tries to reach the starboard lifeboat so he can get it over the side. But by the time he gets to it, the Blackthorn has rolled so far over, the lifeboat can't be launched. They might already be underwater, or the angle of the ship makes it too difficult. I can't quite tell. Several men who've made it to the ship's starboard side climb across the hull and onto the keel as the vessel rolls into an inverted position. A radio officer can't free himself from his headphone set, and he's dragged under as the vessel rolls over. He's pulled underwater, but he manages to cut the strap for the headset, free himself, and he makes it to the surface. A seaman apprentice, William Flores, tries to get life jackets to men in the water. He's only been out of the Coast Guard boot camp for 1 year, but instead of abandoning ship, he goes to a life jacket locker and starts getting life jackets out for the crew. Possibly seeing that the ship is sinking, he also secures the life jacket hatch open with his belt, and this allows life jackets to float out after the ship sinks. He's at his station when the Blackthorn sinks. Meanwhile, around 20 of the ship's crew are below deck, in or close to the mess deck. The Blackthorn is capsizing rapidly with men still inside. Seaman apprentice Michael Gray and Seaman Rhodes are 2 of the crew on the mess deck. Seaman Rhodes stands on the port bulkhead and manages to open and then hold the 130-pound watertight door over his head while his two shipmates escape. He then escapes himself as water starts to rush in through the door. A ship's technician is in the berthing quarter searching for trapped crew when the vessel rolls. He fights his way up the starboard ladder as water rushes down the passageway and floods the berthing quarter. He reaches the top of the ladder, gets out, and then a flow of water sweeps him into the inverted mess deck. From there, he swims through the starboard watertight door to the buoy deck where he escapes. Most of the crew in the ship's mess deck are still there. They can't find a way out. As the vessel rolls over, Seaman apprentice Warren Brewer climbs up into the engine room through a scuttle on the mess deck. He shines a flashlight down through the scuttle and shouts, "I found a way out, I found a way out." Other crew members, still trapped in the pitch dark, rapidly flooding mess deck, rush towards him and the scuttle. They start to climb through the scuttle into the engine room. Seaman apprentice Gray, who's also on the mess deck, thinks the engine room isn't the way out. He convinces two crew members not to follow Brewer and the other men. Instead, he leads them underwater to the starboard door and out to the buoy deck. As they escape from the mess deck, the three men become separated. Gray surfaces alone beneath the inverted buoy deck. He escapes, and he was right not to follow the men into the engine room. There's no way out from the engine room. He tells Lieutenant Commander Seppel, who's hanging onto the side of the vessel, what's happened. It's not clear from the report exactly what he says to his captain, but he probably tells him there are men trapped below deck. Realizing that the rapidly flooding vessel is in imminent danger of sinking, Lieutenant Commander Seppel orders Gray not to go back to the mess deck. He tells him to dive under the bulwark and swim away from the vessel and away from the suction the ship will create when it sinks. The two men who followed Gray don't make it out from below. Divers find one man's body later on the buoy deck, where it's wedged between the bulkhead and other equipment. It's not clear what happens to the other man. In the water, a number of the Blackthorn's crew have gathered around the ship's quarterdeck shack, which has ended up floating next to the ship. Chief Warrant Officer Miller tries to organize them. He orders other men who are sitting on the upturned vessel to get into the water and in their life jackets. He's probably expecting the Blackthorn to sink. He wants the men out of harm's way in case the ship rolls or pitches. He orders everyone to muster around the quarterdeck shack while they wait for rescue. Technician Niesel and Petty Officer Clutter bring a Chief Warrant Officer, Jack Roberts, to the quarterdeck shack. He's unconscious but alive. As the men in the water gather and try to make sense of the situation, the Blackthorn capsizes completely, then sinks within minutes of the collision. 23 men are still on board, including 5 on their first day at sea. Meanwhile, the Capricorn's bow has grounded on the north side of Cut A Channel, 730 meters from the junction of Mullet Key Channel and Cut A Channel. It only suffers minor damage. The Capricorn's anchor dislodges from Blackthorn's side and rests on the bottom of the channel. A shrimp boat, the Bayou, which had been behind the Blackthorn in Cut A Channel, arrives on scene within minutes and starts pulling survivors from the water. The Bayou quickly picks up 23 survivors. The time between the Blackthorn calling the Coast Guard and its sinking is only a few minutes, and Group St. Petersburg orders a lifeboat to the scene around the same time the ship sinks. 5 other smaller Coast Guard boats are dispatched as well. A Coast Guard rescue vessel arrives on scene at 20:52 and rescues 4 survivors. The lifeless body of Warrant Officer Roberts is retrieved from the water where Niesel, Clutter, Bartel and Miller have been supporting him. He's brought aboard and Bartel tries to resuscitate him, but Roberts is dead. All the survivors are then taken to Mullet Key by the Bayou and the Coast Guard rescue vessel. They're turned over to shoreside rescue and emergency personnel. A lifeboat from the Capricorn searches the area for 2 hours, along with 2 Coast Guard helicopters. Civilian divers from Eckerd College search and rescue units arrive on the scene about 2 hours after the accident. They dive down to the Blackthorn to look for survivors. Possibly hampered by currents, they can't get inside the sunken vessel. They don't find any survivors. Hard hat divers from Coastal Diving and Marine Construction in Tampa arrive on scene the next day at 0500. They hear debris randomly striking the inside of the hull while the vessel rolls as swell passes overhead, indicating that it's full of water. 3 bodies are recovered on or around the ship. No air pockets or survivors are found. Scuba divers retrieve 2 more bodies from the buoy deck of Blackthorn later on the 29th of January, 1 day after the incident. One of those bodies is Bruce LaFond, who was struck by the anchor in the shower locker. The active Coast Guard search for survivors ends on the 30th of January. On the 3rd, 5th, and 6th of February, individual bodies were found within 5 miles of the accident site. On the 19th of February, the Blackthorn was raised from the bottom of the channel. 14 bodies were recovered from inside the wreck. 13 of those bodies were found in the ship's engine room. The Blackthorn could not be salvaged. It was taken 20 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and sank as an artificial reef. 23 men lost their lives. Flores, who strapped the life jacket hatch open with his belt, drowned when he went down with the ship. 20 years after the collision, Flores was posthumously awarded the Coast Guard Medal, the service's highest award for heroism in peacetime.